This Saturday at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time on NBC, the 4-1, 2-0 in Big Ten Conference play, 10th ranked Michigan Wolverines. I know that top 10 ranking is surprising to many of you, as I think we all know Michigan isn't a top 10 team, at least in a normal year. But here we are. They are traveling to Husky Stadium to take on the 3-2, 1-1 in Big Ten Conference play Washington Huskies in a rematch of last year's national championship game when both teams were 14-0. Michigan was number 1, Washington was number 2. The 1 and 2 seed actually met up in the national championship game to play for the national championship. Michigan dominated. They won 34-13, but in an even more extreme circumstance than typical, these teams are not the same as they were last year. Washington only returned 2 starters, 2 from last year's team, and about 40% of their production, and that was factoring in incoming transfers. For Michigan, they only returned 5 starters from last year's team, and 40% of their 2023 production, again factoring in incoming transfers. These rosters, coaching staffs, very much new. This is not like Georgia or Ohio State in normal years, or Penn State or Oregon, or even Alabama, who has a lot of newness, that loses players every year or lost a lot after last year, but at least returns their head coach or some critical coaches or key highlight reel players. These teams are very new. And Washington's favored by 3 right now. It opened up, the line did, as Washington minus 2.5. I think Michigan was briefly a favorite. Then the line reopened up with Washington laying 2.5 at home. And the line right now is 2.5, 3. And today, I'm your host, College Football with Sam, and we're going to be previewing this game and giving a prediction. But before we do that, I want you, yes, you, to like the video, to subscribe to the channel, to hit that notification bell, share this video around with other college football fanatics who are passionate about the sport, who love it, and consequently will love the channel. Comment your preview, a few points you have for why each team can win, your prediction, and what you think the most critical matchup is down in the comments section below. And also check out our Discord server where we talk college football 24/7. 24/7, and have a dedicated thread for every Big Ten team, all 18 of them, and more threads for conversation about specific college football topics. You won't want to miss it. So check the Discord server out via the link in the description down below in the pinned comment. It's that simple to join, and also like, share, subscribe, hit the bell, watch the video all the way through. Let's go, and let's get started. On College Football with Sam, we like to view things from a bird's eye view first. Look at the forest, look at the city, the topography, the environment, the climate, and then we like to dive in on the little nitty-gritty details, the individual players, and the structures and schemes and specific matchups. From a broad angle, Michigan is still viewed as the better team, in spite of all of their disappointments and, quite frankly, an even more underwhelming performance than I think a lot of people expected. Washington has also not performed at a high level, but I think a lot of people expected Washington to take a much bigger step back compared to Michigan. And the steps back that both programs have taken is honestly pretty similar. You look at ESPN's FPI, Michigan's only viewed as 9 points superior to the average college football team. Washington, by comparison, is only 7.7 points superior to the average college football team. In S&P Plus, Michigan is 15.7 points superior to the average college football team, while Washington is 13.9 points superior to the average college football team. I like S&P Plus more than FPI, and S&P Plus is higher on both of these teams compared to FPI. And I think that honestly makes sense. Michigan plays at a slower tempo, therefore they're not going to put up as many points. And ESPN's FPI is very much drinking the Kool-Aid of points are the only thing that matters. And in individual games, in winning games, that's true. But FPI, I don't think, does a very good job of factoring in a game where, let's say, a team gets 2 or 3 pick sixes to end. That's the reason they win by 28 instead of 7 or 14. I don't think they do as good of a job of doing that. S&P Plus is more tempo-oriented and cares more about points and also things that can be replicated. And I think that a perfect example of why S&P Plus would be higher on Washington than FPI is the fact that Washington outgained Rutgers by more than 200 yards. And if not for some questionable fourth down conversion attempts and also missed field goals, they would have beaten Rutgers on the road, and Rutgers is a good team. As for Michigan, well, they right now still have one of the tougher strength of schedules. Playing Texas, losing to them, beating USC, and then beating all their other opponents, Fresno State, Arkansas State, and Minnesota. They're 4-1, 2-0 in conference play, and while I don't think they're top 10, as the AP and coaches poll believes, either that or they are top 10, power ratings don't even say they're top 15, then this is a very weak year in college football. And I think it's a very, very weak year in football regardless. I don't think the number one team in the country right now, who for me is Alabama, would beat any of the national champions in the 4-team playoff era. I don't think they would beat any of those national champions right now. Maybe I'll think differently at the end of the year. As of now, though, well, I do think that this is a down year. And once you factor in home field advantage in FPI and S&P Plus, Washington should win this game by about a point. So I can see why Washington is favored. And FPI, in fact, gives the Washington Huskies a 57.8% chance to win the game. My broad team comparison continues, and Michigan is actually inferior to Washington in points per play margin. Points per play margin measures dominance without really adjusting for strength of schedule, and this to me is perfectly sensical. Washington's played an easier schedule, and they haven't been that much worse. There's an argument they're actually better so far than Michigan objectively. It makes sense that they have a 0.110 points per play margin, which means they score a little over a tenth more points per play than their opponent does per play. Michigan only has a 0.097 points per play margin, which means they score roughly a little under a 100th, or no, a little under a tenth of a point. So many things in my mind. A little under a tenth of a point more per play than their opponent does. So Washington, not factoring in schedule, has been the more dominant team. Michigan, once you factor in schedule, though, has been the more dominant team. They're 17th in game control, which is a number that honestly kind of shocked me. But I think game control is better than FPI in taking into account like pace of the game, and Michigan has done a pretty good job of holding on to leads, or at least sustaining leads outside of USC for the fourth quarter and Texas for the entire game. And those are some of the better teams in the country. Texas may be the best team in the country. I had them as the number one team in the country before Alabama did what they did. And USC is up there too. And right now a top 20, probably more top 15 team. They have the 15th toughest strength of schedule, the Wolverines do. Washington is the 81st strength of schedule, 59th in game control. They never really controlled their opponent in Washington State, their rival who they lost to. Rutgers was ahead of them for basically the entire game. And honestly, their performance against Northwestern, in my view, was kind of disgusting. I expected, given how Northwestern looked against Duke and some of their initial games, that if Washington was a competent team, they would come out and just totally spank them, and relatively quickly. But that didn't happen. It didn't happen. They won, and they won by double digits, but they didn't spank Northwestern. So while Michigan being high in game control is surprising to me, at least top 20, Washington being as low as they are isn't shocking at all. The critical matchup for this game is really, can Michigan game control Washington? That's what the critical matchup is. Can Washington's defense, led by Bill Belichick's son, Steve Belichick, can they fight up front and do at least what Minnesota did against Michigan, where outside of maybe one or two drives, just stifle Michigan's rushing defense? Can they do that? Because if not, Michigan will control the game. And the game control metrics that I just gave you will reign true. And Michigan could actually go in. They could completely sell out because of a bye week and do something they haven't done all year, which is basically dominate an opponent. But Washington could very easily win this game and perhaps dominate Michigan and get ahead of them if they can force several punts, get into good field position, if Will Rogers can work Michigan's linebacker core in secondary with Denzel Boston. The path to doing that is giving him more possessions and more opportunities. Also opportunities and possessions for Brennan Carroll and Jed Fish to develop and adapt their offensive game plans. So that's what I think the critical matchup is here. It is Donovan Edwards and Kalel Mullings, Colston Loveland, Max Bredesen, and Marlon Klein, and Miles Hinton, Josh Preby, Dominic Giudice, Greg Crippen, Giovanni El-Hadi, Evan Link. Personally, Greg Crippen should be starting ahead of Giudice. I think that's big-time staff hubris there and them not wanting to be wrong. It seems to be a theme with this Michigan staff, honestly, is being stubborn and holding the team back from their potential. But with Washington, with all the transfers they have gotten and what I view Jed Fish entering this season, I am kind of shocked they lost to Washington State and even losing to Rutgers in the fashion that they did. And speed option with Will Rogers on 4th and goal is just the epitome of a boneheaded play. So these teams have a lot to prove in this matchup. And the players I just named for Michigan, they are going up against a Washington defense that features Isaiah Ward, Jacob Bandis, Sebastian Valdez, Voy Tanufi on the D-line, Alfonso Tuputala, one of the 2 returning starters, and Carson Brunner at linebacker, Ephesians Pryshok, Cameron Fabakulainen, the second of the returning starters, Cameron Broussard, Thaddeus Dixon, and Jordan Shaw. Those are Washington starters on defense. That will be the matchup here. Michigan on the season has had, quite frankly, given how limited their offense is and how many stacked boxes they have faced, they've had a pretty successful ground attack. Look at some of these numbers here. Michigan's offense on the season has only scored 24.8 points per game, only about 0.407 points per play. Both are outside of the top 50. You look at rushing offense. Michigan is rushing for 5.1 yards per carry, 28th. They're 29th in rushing yards per game, 194.8. They are 40th in rushing attempts per game, averaging 38.0. And, I mean, honestly, the reason they're not running for more is because their tempo's very slow, they like to chew clock, and they don't have the potential to extend drives because of their limited passing offense. They are 4th in rushing yards percentage. I think the only Big Ten team that's ahead of them is Iowa, who is 69% of their offensive yards on the ground. Michigan is about 63% of their yards on the ground. And then Washington's rushing defense, meanwhile, their total defense, they're top 10 in opponent yards per game, allowing 249. They only allow 4 yards per play, 9th. But I think those numbers to a certain degree are inflated by a weak strength of schedule. And if you watched the Rutgers game, you saw that the Scarlet Knights could effectively move the football. In rushing defense, Washington allows opponents to run for 3.6 yards per carry, for 7 first downs per game, for 113.5 yards per game on only 31.5 attempts. So, yeah, that's that. A skeptical run defense, but with talent going up against a one-dimensional Michigan offense that's good at running the football. You expect Washington and Steve Belichick to stack the box, and for Michigan, if they're well coached, they should take advantage of some of these numbers, because I guarantee you that Minnesota has a better defense than Washington does here. But if Washington can get stops and force punts, their quarterback and wide receiver room, I think, can exploit this Michigan linebacker room and also the secondary. You look at Will Rogers, and Will Rogers on the season, he has a 174.7 passer rating. 10 touchdowns, zippo, no interceptions, 1,354 passing yards, 74.8% completion percentage. He's averaging 9.2 yards per pass attempt. He's been sacked 6 times, and this offensive line is not great. But in all of his games, he's had a 160 passer rating or better. Totally a system guy. I think he has better receivers than the nation knows, and yes, he has played a weak strength of schedule. But he's done a good job, in my mind. He's 51st in QBR, 64.8, but he's in a really, and I mean really, good system with good receivers, good coordinators, an underrated linebacker in Jonah Coleman and Cameron Davis backing him up. You look at Denzel Boston, who leads Washington in receiving yards. He has 412 receiving yards, 7 receiving touchdowns. Giles Jackson, former Michigan player, 401 receiving yards and a receiving touchdown. Decker DeGraff and Kaliki Latu each have over 100 receiving yards at tight end. You look at running back, Jonah Coleman's averaging 7.2 yards per carry. He has 4 rushing touchdowns, 521 yards on 72 carries. And Cameron Davis is averaging 5 yards per carry. I mean, this is a good rushing offense that Washington has, and a great offense overall. I would give Michigan the edge at running back, tight end, O-line. Again, Washington, I think, easily takes the cake at quarterback and wide receiver. For Michigan, their leading passer right now is still Davis Warren, which that obviously tells you something about the QB room. Alex Orji has 133 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, a pick, a 108.5 passer rating. He looked way better against Minnesota than he did against USC, and maybe he can continue that significant improvement by game against Washington, but you cannot give that type of benefit of the doubt, especially 5 games through. Kalel Mullings is averaging 7 yards per carry. He has 6 rushing touchdowns, 540 yards, 77 carries. Donovan Edwards has 2 rushing touchdowns, 258 rushing yards on 59 carries, 4.4 yards per carry. Michigan's receiver leading is Colston Loveland with 23 receptions, 228 yards and a touchdown. Their second leading receiver is Marlon Klein, 6 receptions, 69 receiving yards, no touchdowns. Samaj Morgan, Tyler Morris, they each have a receiving touchdown, same with Donovan Edwards and Hogan Hansen. The tight end room for Michigan is very deep. If they had a better quarterback, you would see the tight ends with a lot more receptions and receiving yards. Of course, the wide receivers would benefit too, but Michigan's tight ends it's a lot like Iowa's offense last year. A lot in regards to the passing offense. The rushing offense is better than anything Iowa has had for years outside of maybe this season with Caleb Johnson. But the two teams this year, and also looking at their, well, especially Iowa's history in recent memory, are similar. They are offensively. You look at the defenses here. I would give Michigan D-line and DB in a heartbeat, easily. But after the linebackers, I thought, did a good job against USC for most of the game. Jayshon Barhams had his struggles in every game. They really, I don't think they did all that well against Minnesota, particularly in the fourth quarter. Meanwhile, Washington's linebackers are graded very highly by Pro Football Focus. Alfonso Tuputala is experienced. He's tied for the leader in sacks with 2.5. A pass defended, 25 total tackles. Washington on the season is 12 sacks, 3 interceptions, 2 forced fumbles, and a fumble recovery with 25 passes defended. Michigan is 25 passes defended, 5 interceptions, 2 forced fumbles, 2 fumble recoveries, and 13 sacks. Josiah Stewart leads the team with 4 sacks. Mason Graham has 3. Josiah Stewart also has a forced fumble, and he was out for the Minnesota game. Same with Will Johnson. Both were dealing with injuries sustained in the USC game, and they were taken out, which I think, given that Michigan beat Minnesota, was honestly a wise move. And if not for, again, quarterback and also Wink Martindale, I think, being too stubborn, which are things that likely won't be changed, but could be, it's more fixable than an offensive line that, let's say, is like Colorado's last season. They could have ran away with that Minnesota game and dominated. But I don't know how good Michigan's linebacker room is anymore. I quite frankly don't. It is, I would say, let me think of an accurate comparison. It's honestly like me to a lesser degree with Nebraska's defensive line. Like after that Illinois game, I don't know anymore, especially given how Penn State wrecked They destroyed that Illinois O-line. So how good is Nebraska's defensive line? I'm more confident in it than Michigan's linebacker room, but a lot of questions. And also to a larger degree, I'd say Aiden Childs. I don't know how good Aiden Childs is. One minute he's all the way up here, like against Prairie View A&M, and I think Ohio State for much of the game. Next minute, all the way down here, and literally plays like Davis Warren and Deacon Hill with throwing all those interceptions. So there's a lot of questions there. That's why I gave Washington I honestly would say, gun to my head, I'd give them the edge at linebacker right now. But Michigan at defensive line with Mason Graham, Kenneth Grant, especially if they're healthy with Josiah Stewart, Derek Moore, and TJ Guy, Rayshon Benny, I think they still have the best defensive line in the nation. The reason that a lot of these statistics give them a bad rap is because their linebacker room has issues. The secondary, I think really until these past 2 weeks, has had major issues, and they haven't been perfect in these past 2 weeks either. They're not being schemed properly, and the offense sucks. And then when you face Texas with those constraints, and then USC, well, you're not going to be statistically dominant. I still think Michigan's D-line, when healthy, is the nation's best. Outside of that, though, Michigan does not have a ton going for them for their whole team, at least relative to like an Oregon, a Penn State, and Ohio State, teams that I honestly thought Michigan would be competing with this season for that number 1 spot. And I'd also give Michigan the edge in the secondary. When healthy, you have Will Johnson there. That automatically makes Michigan's secondary improved with his presence. Jair Hill has taken a big step forward. Safety is a little bit of a concern for Michigan, in my opinion, especially since Hill has stepped up at corner and I think made that room more secure. But Washington's secondary is not necessarily a bright spot nationally either. Again, 25 passes defended, 3 interceptions. You look at Washington's pass defense, it's statistically better than Michigan's, but that's because they haven't faced Miller Moss or Quinn Ewers. And honestly, Minnesota's quarterback, Max Brosmer, may be the best quarterback on Washington's schedule if they were to play. I think that Kaliakmanis is a better passer than Brosmer is, or at least QBR says he is, around that ballpark. But Michigan's secondary still forces more incompletions per game. They face a lot of pass attempts, more than Washington's secondary does. They face 13 more pass attempts per game. 13 more. And they're actually better than Washington in opponent yards per completion, where they only allowed 9.8. They allow 6 yards per pass attempt. Michigan is 2.6 sacks per game. Washington is 2.8, but again, tougher competition. The sack percentage for Michigan is about 6%. Those numbers need to improve. Washington's is about 9%, which is respectable. And Washington's also third in opponent average team passer rating. So pass defense, a little bit more murky. Michigan, I think, easily takes the cake in run defense, and I'd lean them in pass defense as well. But Washington's a push at linebacker with Michigan, and if you had a gun to my head, I'd probably pick the Huskies at linebacker. In the trenches, I'd also give it to Michigan here. Better O-line, better D-line. No more questions or statements need to be made. For special teams, I would give to Michigan there. The arrow should be pointing the other way. You look at efficiency for special teams nationally. Michigan up here in the Big Ten is 20th on special teams. Washington, well, they're all the way down at 121st, like with Penn State, Nebraska, teams that can't make a field goal, and then Minnesota's 131st. I don't know exactly what that's about because Dragan Kesic is a better kicker than anything Penn State and Nebraska or currently Washington has, but there's probably like returns in there or punting as well. Michigan definitely has the better special teams unit by a mile compared to Washington. And as for coaching, I'd give Michigan the edge on defensive coaching. I think they have the better defensive coordinator, and I think more clearly they have the better defensive assistants, or at least Michigan's talent is so good that it's masking poverty coaching. I think we'll have to wait a little bit longer to see that. And I also think that Michigan's strength and conditioning program is still one of the best in the country. But when you're strong and you're athletic and you're well developed in terms of potential, but you're not being coached to use that potential, how much does it really matter? And this is where Washington comes in. I think they have the better coach. I think Jed Fish is a very underrated coach, definitely better than Sharon Moore. And offensively, easily, I'd take Brennan Carroll and his offensive staff any day over Kirk Campbell and his. The only really impressive coach for Michigan on the offensive side of the ball positionally has been Tony Alford, and maybe a little bit of Grant Newsome, given how much the offensive line lost, and I still think it's a good offensive line. But we'll have to see. These staffs are pretty new in their given locations. Washington's is more proven than Michigan's is, but there's still a lot to learn with these staffs, as there's a lot of, newness to them. And this leads me to my prediction, where I think Michigan covers. I think that they win 27-17. You look at how this matchup is set up, and I think that Washington's defense is a little bit overvalued. I think that Michigan's defense is going to have success against a quarterback in Will Rogers who's not as dynamic as Miller Moss or Quinn Ewers. I think Washington, in a lot of ways, is like Minnesota, or like what Minnesota wants to be on offense, because they have a better rushing attack currently than Minnesota does on offense, though part of that may be due to the fact that Minnesota played Iowa, who is one of the better defenses in all of college football, and they didn't have Darius Taylor against North Carolina. But Washington is who Minnesota wants to be offensively, and they are at home, and it is a night game. It's on the West Coast. However, Washington's defense, I think, while it is well coached and they do have some good players, there's so much newness there, and there also isn't a lot of, proven performance, especially in stopping the run. I mean, Washington knew what was coming. They knew what was coming from Rutgers. And Kyle Monangai was breaking tackles. He got good blocks. And overall, I'd say Washington did a somewhat respectable job against Rutgers' rushing attack, but Rutgers ran for 184 yards, 5.6 yards per carry, 2 touchdowns and 33 carries. Washington ran for 207 yards, 7.1 yards per carry on 29 carries. Washington is not going to have that type of success in the ground against Michigan, because Rutgers, for 3 games in a row against Akron, Virginia Tech, and Washington, part of it is because Washington and Virginia Tech do have good rushing offenses, they've allowed over 6 yards per carry. They have serious issues in stopping the run. And I think that Michigan will be well prepared for stopping the run because of the talent they have. If the defense is healthy, and maybe that's me banking on something that I shouldn't bank on, but I expect Will Johnson and Josiah Stewart to be healthy. If they are, they're going to get pressure on Will Rogers. They're going to limit Jonah Coleman. They're going to force Rogers to make big plays outside of the system he's comfortable in. And I don't think that will end well. And as for Michigan, this may be the worst run defense, and probably is, that they have faced since Arkansas State. It's much better than Arkansas State's, but I think that Edwards and Mullings and the offensive line and tight ends will have success blocking. Michigan will win the TOP battle. I think Michigan will probably be once again outgained by Washington in total yardage, or it will be close, but Michigan's been more effective at scoring points compared to creating yards. I think Michigan wins. I think they cover. I think it's going to be a close game, and then Michigan punches it in late to get a final touchdown and make the game look further away and less competitive than it actually was. Thank you all so much for watching. Remember to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment your thoughts down below. Thanks to Crash2488 and Brasco Rascal for being Heisman members of my Patreon page. Thanks to Chris Lane, Carlo OH, Ismar, Tyler 9, Chilton Cush for being All-American members of my Patreon page. Thanks to John Lynn, Roaming Gnome, Matthew Sale, Austin Christmas, and Janaisha Cockrell for being all-conference members as well. Check out my merchandise store, Patreon page, and Discord server via the links in the description and down below in the pinned comment. And last but not least, have a great day, guys. Go Huskies and go Blue.